Robert Bobby Mitchell had driven 8 hours through the humid Georgia heat, his late wife's burgundy Ford F-150 cutting through the afternoon sun toward Riverside High School. At 58, the decorated Marine veteran carried himself with the quiet dignity that comes from 3 decades of service and the weight of raising a daughter alone after losing his beloved Margaret to cancer. His dress blues, pressed to perfection despite the years, still fit like they were tailored yesterday. Not from vanity, but because there were things Bobby Mitchell simply didn't know how to do halfway. The worn photograph tucked inside his jacket pocket showed Margaret cradling baby Sarah, a reminder of promises made and kept through deployments, heartbreak, and the long road of single parenthood. Today was Sarah's graduation day, the culmination of 18 years of sacrifice, late-night homework sessions, and the quiet strength that had carried them both through their darkest hours. But as Bobby settled into his front-row seat, straightening his uniform one final time, he had no idea that this ceremony would become a defining moment. Not just for his daughter, but for everyone who witnessed what happened when 2 security guards decided that a Black Marine veteran belonged in the back. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The trouble started during the national anthem, when Bobby stood with the practiced stillness of a man who had saluted that flag in places where it meant the difference between hope and despair. Jake Morrison and Tommy Walsh, 2 private security guards barely past their 20s, began their approach with the kind of swagger that comes from small authority wielded in smaller minds. They moved through the crowded gymnasium like they owned it, their Harlan Security Services badges catching the fluorescent lights as they zeroed in on the one person who seemed to command respect without demanding it. The air grew thick with tension as Morrison, short and stocky with the demeanor of someone compensating for something, leaned down to Bobby's ear with words that would echo through that gymnasium long after the last diploma was handed out. "We're going to need you to come with us," he said, his voice carrying the kind of casual menace that had followed Bobby through boardrooms, restaurants, and now his own daughter's graduation ceremony. But Bobby Mitchell hadn't survived Kandahar, hadn't buried his wife, hadn't raised a daughter alone, just to be moved to the back of anywhere by anyone. His response was measured, calm, and absolute. "I drove 8 hours to watch my daughter walk across that stage. I'll be sitting right here." What Morrison and Walsh didn't know was that 6 Navy SEALs, now in their 60s, had just walked through those gymnasium doors, and they remembered exactly who Robert Mitchell was and what he had done for them in the dust and gunfire of Afghanistan 15 years ago. The trouble began during the national anthem, when Bobby stood with the practiced stillness of a man who had saluted that flag in places where it meant the difference between hope and despair. His posture was ramrod straight, shoulders squared, hands at his sides, not because the moment demanded it, but because 3 decades of military service had carved that stance into his very bones. The gymnasium around him buzzed with the restless energy of families eager to celebrate their children's achievements, but Bobby existed in a bubble of quiet reverence, his mind briefly transported to dusty Afghan outposts where that same anthem had played over crackling radios while good men prepared for missions that not all would return from. It was during those final notes, as the last echoes of "The Land of the Free" faded into polite applause, that Jake Morrison and Tommy Walsh began their approach. They moved through the crowded gymnasium with the kind of swagger that comes from small authority wielded by smaller minds, their Harlan Security Services badges catching the fluorescent lights as they navigated between folding chairs and proud grandparents clutching programs. Morrison, the shorter of the 2, was built like a fire hydrant, stocky, compact, with the kind of shaved head that suggested he was compensating for something he'd lost too early in life. His partner Walsh stood nearly 6 feet tall, but carried himself with the loose-limbed awkwardness of someone who had never quite grown into his frame, his jaw working methodically on a piece of gum that he chewed with the mechanical persistence of a man trying to fill the silence in his own head. They weren't police officers, despite the way they carried themselves. Their uniforms were standard rent-a-cop issue, black polo shirts tucked into cargo pants, utility belts laden with radios, flashlights, and the kind of plastic handcuffs that spoke more to wishful thinking than actual authority. Morrison wore his shirt a size too small, the fabric straining across his chest in a way that suggested he spent more time at the gym than was strictly necessary for someone whose primary job involved checking tickets and telling teenagers to quiet down. Walsh's uniform hung loose on his lanky frame, the sleeves pushed up to reveal forearms covered in tattoos that looked like they'd been acquired during a particularly regrettable weekend in his early 20s. Neither man looked older than 30, and their youth showed in the way they moved, with the kind of confidence that comes from never having been truly tested, never having faced a situation where their authority meant less than nothing, and their badges were just pieces of plastic pinned to polyester shirts. They had probably spent their careers dealing with drunk parents at Little League games and teenagers sneaking cigarettes behind the gymnasium, situations where their uniforms and stern voices were enough to restore order. They had no idea they were about to encounter a man who had faced down Taliban fighters in the mountains of Afghanistan, who had pulled wounded comrades from burning vehicles while bullets whistled overhead, who had learned the difference between real authority and the kind that came from a clipboard and a radio. Bobby noticed them immediately, his peripheral vision tracking their movement with the automatic awareness that comes from years of training and combat experience. He didn't turn his head, didn't shift in his seat, but every fiber of his being cataloged their approach. The way Morrison's hand rested on his radio, the nervous energy in Walsh's gait, the purposeful direction of their movement that suggested he was their destination. It was the kind of situational awareness that had kept him alive in places where a moment's inattention could mean the difference between coming home and coming home in a box. The gymnasium around them continued its celebration, oblivious to the brewing confrontation. Parents snapped photos with phones held high. Grandparents dabbed at their eyes with tissues, and siblings fidgeted in their seats while waiting for the ceremony to begin in earnest. The air smelled of floor wax and the faint aroma of concession stand popcorn, mixed with the particular scent of nervous excitement that permeated every high school graduation since the tradition began. Somewhere in the distance, a baby cried briefly before being hushed by anxious parents, and the sound system crackled with feedback as the audio technician made final adjustments to the microphones on stage. Morrison reached Bobby's row first, his approach calculated to seem casual, but carrying the unmistakable weight of official business. He stopped beside Bobby's chair and leaned down just enough to be heard over the ambient noise of the crowd. His voice pitched low in the way that suggested this was meant to be a private conversation. "Excuse me, sir," he said, the words carrying a politeness that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We're going to need you to come with us." Bobby slowly turned his head, his movement deliberate and controlled. His dark eyes met Morrison's pale blue ones with the kind of steady gaze that had stared down insurgents and hostile villagers, that had remained calm during firefights and tense negotiations with local tribal leaders. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to command, each word measured and precise. Walsh stepped forward then, positioning himself slightly behind his partner in a formation that was probably meant to seem intimidating, but instead revealed their inexperience with actual confrontation. "Yeah," he said, his voice carrying a slight tremor that suggested he was less comfortable with this encounter than his partner. "This section's for families of graduating seniors." Bobby's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. A flicker of recognition that this wasn't about seating arrangements or crowd control. He reached into his coat pocket with the same deliberate care he had shown throughout the encounter, his movements smooth and unthreatening as he withdrew the printed ticket he had shown at the door. The paper was slightly creased from being folded in his wallet during the 8-hour drive from Temple, but the information was clear. 3rd row, left side, family seating confirmed. "This is my seat," Bobby said, holding the ticket where both guards could see it. 3rd row, left side, family seating confirmed. His voice remained level, professional, the tone of a man stating facts rather than arguing a point. Morrison didn't even look at the ticket. His eyes remained fixed on Bobby's face with the kind of stubborn determination that suggested he had already made up his mind about how this encounter was going to proceed. "We got told it's full," he said, the words carrying an edge of banality that suggested the conversation was over as far as he was concerned. Bobby's eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger, but with the quiet calculation of a man processing information and finding it lacking. "It was full when I sat down, too," he replied, his voice carrying just a hint of steel beneath the surface calm. "You want to tell me who gave that order?" The question hung in the air between them, and for a moment Walsh shifted uncomfortably, his jaw working harder on his gum as he glanced around the gymnasium as if looking for backup or guidance. Morrison, however, straightened up slightly, his chest puffing out in the way that suggested he was preparing to escalate rather than de-escalate the situation. "Look," Walsh said, his voice carrying a nervous edge that suggested he was beginning to realize this wasn't going according to whatever script they had been given. "It's not a big deal. There's some extra seats in the back. Let's not make this anything it doesn't have to be." And there it was, the phrase that transformed this from a simple misunderstanding into something much more significant. Bobby's expression hardened almost imperceptibly, his military bearing becoming even more pronounced as he processed the implications of what had just been said. The suggestion wasn't about logistics or crowd management. It was about something older, something quieter, something that had followed him through boardrooms and restaurants, through job interviews and parent-teacher conferences, through a lifetime of encounters where his presence was tolerated but not welcomed. "I drove 8 hours to watch my daughter walk across that stage," Bobby said, his voice dropping to a register that carried the weight of absolute conviction. "I'll be sitting right here." The words carried the finality of a man who had made his decision and would not be moved, not by threats or intimidation, or the kind of casual racism that dressed itself up as policy and procedure. Around them, the atmosphere in the gymnasium began to shift, as nearby families started to notice the confrontation brewing in their midst. Heads turned with the subtle curiosity of people trying to appear as though they weren't watching while hanging on every word. A woman 2 rows over nudged her husband and nodded toward the scene, her expression shifting from mild interest to concern as she began to grasp the nature of what was unfolding. Morrison's face flushed slightly, the color rising from his collar as he realized that his authority was being challenged in front of an audience. His hand moved instinctively toward the radio clipped to his belt, fingers drumming against the plastic casing as he considered his options. Walsh took a half-step back, his nervous energy becoming more pronounced as he glanced around the gymnasium with the expression of someone who was beginning to wish he was anywhere else. "Sir," Morrison said, his voice carrying a harder edge now, the politeness beginning to crack under the pressure of his wounded ego. "I'm going to ask one more time. You can move to the back, or we can make this more difficult than it needs to be." Bobby looked up at him with the kind of steady gaze that had faced down Taliban commanders and hostile interrogators, that had remained calm during mortar attacks and roadside bombings. "You can ask all day," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had commanded respect in places where respect was earned through blood and sacrifice. "I'm not moving." Walsh sucked his teeth, a sound that carried his frustration and growing discomfort with the situation. "Maybe you'd be more comfortable in the back," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush as if he was trying to convince himself as much as Bobby. "That's all we're saying." And there it was, the phrase that stripped away any pretense that this was about seating arrangements or crowd control. The words hung in the air like a challenge, carrying the weight of decades of segregation and discrimination, of being told to move to the back of buses and restaurants and theaters, of being made to feel like a second-class citizen in the country he had sworn to defend with his life. Bobby didn't respond immediately. He simply looked at Walsh with the kind of expression that suggested he was seeing right through the young man's words to the ugly truth beneath them. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implication and the weight of history, while around them the gymnasium continued its celebration, oblivious to the moment of truth playing out in the third row. The air itself seemed to shift, the way it does when people start sensing that a line has been crossed, that something significant is happening that goes beyond the ordinary friction of daily life. Parents in nearby rows began to pay closer attention, their conversations dying away as they focused on the confrontation with the kind of morbid fascination that draws people to accidents and arguments. Someone in the bleachers tilted their phone slightly, perhaps recording, perhaps just pretending to check messages while keeping the camera pointed toward the brewing conflict. Morrison noticed the attention they were drawing and felt his authority slipping away with each passing second. His hand moved closer to his radio, fingers hovering over the call button as he prepared to escalate the situation rather than admit defeat. The flush in his cheeks deepened, and his jaw clenched with the kind of stubborn determination that comes from being challenged in front of an audience and refusing to back down. But Bobby remained seated, his hands resting calmly on his thighs, his expression unchanged, his presence filling the space around him with the kind of quiet dignity that comes from knowing exactly who you are and refusing to let anyone make you forget it. He had faced down worse men than these in places where the stakes were life and death, and he wasn't about to be intimidated by two security guards with delusions of authority and a fundamental misunderstanding of who they were dealing with. The confrontation was reaching a tipping point, the moment when words would either de-escalate into embarrassed retreat or explode into something much more serious. Morrison's hand hovered over his radio. Walsh shifted nervously from foot to foot, and Bobby sat like a statue, unmovable and unshakable, waiting to see which way the wind would blow and prepared for whatever came next. What none of them knew was that 6 Navy SEALs had just walked through the gymnasium doors, and they had recognized the man sitting in the third row as someone who had once dragged them through gunfire and saved their lives in the mountains of Afghanistan. The cavalry was coming, and the 2 security guards were about to learn the difference between authority and respect, between power and strength, between the kind of backup that comes from a badge and the kind that comes from brotherhood forged in blood and sacrifice. The moment hung suspended like a held breath, pregnant with possibility and consequence, while the graduation ceremony continued around them, and Sarah Mitchell prepared to walk across a stage that her father had driven 8 hours and face down 2 bullies to see. The gymnasium doors at the far end of the building opened with the soft whisper of hydraulics, but the sound might as well have been thunder, for the way it cut through the tension that had settled over the crowd like a heavy blanket. What followed wasn't dramatic. There were no marching boots, no shouted commands, no coordinated entrance that would have drawn attention from the ceremony still struggling to maintain its dignity on stage. Instead, 6 men filtered in one by one, each taking a different route through the crowded gymnasium, each finding a seat with the kind of casual precision that spoke to years of tactical training and battlefield experience. The first to enter was Commander James Creed Patterson, now 62 years old but carrying himself with the same ramrod-straight posture that had commanded respect in the dusty outposts of Afghanistan 15 years earlier. His salt-and-pepper beard was neatly trimmed, his civilian clothes, a dark navy blazer over pressed khakis, spoke to a man who understood the importance of blending in while never truly disappearing. He moved down the center aisle with the unhurried confidence of someone who had walked through minefields and hostile villages, his eyes scanning the room with the automatic awareness that never truly leaves a man who has spent decades in harm's way. When he spotted Bobby in the third row, surrounded by the two security guards whose body language screamed escalation, something shifted behind his weathered features. Not anger, but the kind of cold calculation that comes from recognizing a threat to someone under your protection. Creed didn't head directly toward the confrontation. Instead, he selected a seat in the fourth row, center aisle, positioning himself where he could move quickly in any direction while maintaining clear sight lines to both Bobby and the exits. His movements were economical, precise, the kind of efficiency that comes from a lifetime of making every action count. As he settled into the plastic folding chair, his hands rested loosely on his thighs, but anyone who knew him would recognize the deceptive casualness. He was coiled like a spring, ready to move at the first sign that the situation was about to turn physical. 30 seconds later, Master Chief Luis Mendoza slipped through the same doors, his approach even more subtle than Creed's. At 59, Luis had the compact build of a man who had spent his career carrying heavy equipment through impossible terrain. His shoulders broad beneath a simple gray polo shirt that did nothing to hide the strength still evident in his frame. His dark hair was shot through with silver now, and the lines around his eyes spoke to years of squinting through desert sun and ocean spray. But his movements retained the fluid grace of a man who had spent decades moving silently through enemy territory. He chose a seat along the right wall, 3 rows back from Bobby, his position allowing him to watch both the security guards and the crowd's reaction to the brewing confrontation. Luis had been the team's communications specialist in Afghanistan, the man responsible for calling in air support and coordinating with command when everything went sideways. He had been the one on the radio that day in Kandahar when Bobby, then Gunnery Sergeant Mitchell, had dragged Creed through 200 yards of open ground while Taliban fighters poured automatic weapons fire down from the ridgeline. Luis had coordinated the helicopter extraction that had saved all their lives, his voice calm and professional, even as mortars exploded around their position. Now, 15 years later, he was using those same skills to assess the tactical situation unfolding in a high school gymnasium, his mind automatically cataloging exit routes, potential threats, and the positioning of civilians who might be caught in the crossfire if things went bad. Senior Chief David Tank Thompson entered next, his massive frame, 6 feet 4 inches and still carrying most of the 230 pounds that had made him the team's heavy weapons specialist, moving with surprising grace through the crowded gymnasium. At 61, Tank's hair had gone completely white, but his presence still filled a room the way it had when he carried a Mark 48 machine gun through the mountains of the Hindu Kush. He wore a simple black t-shirt and jeans, the civilian clothes doing nothing to disguise the fact that this was a man who had spent his career breaking things and hurting people in service of his country. Tank positioned himself near the bleachers on the left side of the gymnasium, his elevated position giving him a clear view of the entire scene, while keeping him close enough to intervene if the security guards made the mistake of putting their hands on Bobby. Tank had been the one who had provided covering fire during Bobby's rescue of Creed, his machine gun chattering in controlled bursts that had kept the Taliban fighters pinned down long enough for the extraction to succeed. He had seen Bobby's courage under fire, had watched him risk his own life without hesitation to save a teammate, and the bond forged in that moment of shared danger had never weakened. Now, watching two rent-a-cops with delusions of authority trying to intimidate the man who had saved his brother's life, Tank felt the familiar cold anger that had made him so effective in combat. Not the hot rage that led to mistakes, but the icy calculation that turned ordinary men into instruments of precise violence. Petty Officer First Class Michael Hawk Rodriguez was the fourth to arrive, his lean frame and weathered features marking him as a man who had spent his career moving fast and hitting hard. At 58, Hawk retained the wiry strength of a marathon runner, his dark eyes constantly moving as he assessed the situation with the paranoid awareness that had kept him alive through multiple deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. He had been the team's point man, the one who led them through hostile territory and spotted the ambushes before they could spring. Now, he was using those same skills to read the crowd, noting which parents were starting to pay attention to the confrontation, which ones were reaching for their phones, and how quickly the situation was escalating beyond the security guard's ability to control. Hawk selected a position near the main entrance, his back to the wall and his eyes on the security guards who were clearly out of their depth. He had been the youngest member of the team during their deployment to Afghanistan, barely 23 years old when Bobby had pulled them all out of that ambush in Kandahar. The experience had taught him that leadership wasn't about rank or authority. It was about character, about the willingness to put yourself at risk for others, about the kind of quiet courage that Bobby had demonstrated that day and was demonstrating again now by refusing to be moved from his rightful place. Chief Petty Officer Samuel Doc Williams entered fifth, his medical training evident in the way he automatically scanned the crowd for potential injuries and evacuation routes. At 60, Doc had the gentle demeanor of a man who had spent his career healing rather than hurting, but his presence carried the quiet authority of someone who had made life-and-death decisions under the worst possible circumstances. His graying beard and wire-rimmed glasses gave him an almost professorial appearance, but the way he moved, with the careful precision of a man accustomed to working with his hands under pressure, marked him as someone who had seen more than his share of violence and trauma. Doc positioned himself near the center of the gymnasium, close enough to provide medical assistance if needed, but far enough back to avoid escalating the confrontation. He had been the one who had treated Creed's wounds after Bobby's rescue, working to stabilize him for the helicopter ride to the field hospital while bullets still whistled overhead. He had seen Bobby's hands shaking as the adrenaline wore off, had watched him struggle with the weight of command and the responsibility for his men's lives. That experience had taught Doc that true strength wasn't about never being afraid. It was about doing what needed to be done despite the fear, about maintaining your dignity and composure even when the world around you was falling apart. The last to enter was Senior Chief Anthony Bear Johnson, whose massive presence, 6 feet 6 inches and 250 pounds of muscle and bone, seemed to change the very atmosphere of the gymnasium. At 63, Bear was the oldest of the group, his completely bald head and full gray beard giving him the appearance of a Viking warrior who had somehow found his way into the 21st century. He had been the team's demolitions expert, the man responsible for breaching doors and clearing obstacles, and his reputation for controlled violence had preceded him into every combat zone. Now, he was using that same intimidating presence to send a message to the security guards who were clearly beginning to realize they had bitten off more than they could chew. Bear didn't bother looking for a seat. Instead, he positioned himself at the back of the gymnasium, arms crossed over his massive chest, his eyes locked on the two guards who were still hovering around Bobby like vultures circling wounded prey. His presence was a statement, Not a threat, exactly, but a promise that if things escalated beyond words, there would be consequences that the guards were not prepared to handle. Bear had been the one who had carried the wounded Afghan interpreter to safety during their extraction from Kandahar, his massive frame allowing him to move quickly through the rocky terrain, while Bobby and the others provided covering fire. The experience had cemented his respect for Bobby's leadership and his willingness to follow him anywhere, even into a confrontation with small-town security guards who didn't understand the kind of man they were dealing with. The 6 men had positioned themselves throughout the gymnasium with the unconscious precision of a military unit, their placement creating overlapping fields of observation and potential intervention without appearing coordinated or threatening to the civilian crowd. They didn't look at each other, didn't signal or communicate in any obvious way, but their presence created a palpable shift in the atmosphere of the room. Parents, who had been focused on the graduation ceremony, began to notice the tension, their conversations dying away as they sensed that something significant was happening in the 3rd row. Bobby felt their presence before he saw them, the way a man feels the approach of a storm or the weight of eyes upon him. It was the same sensation he had experienced in Afghanistan when his team was moving into position, the knowledge that he was no longer alone, that men who understood the meaning of loyalty and brotherhood were watching his back. He didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge their presence in any obvious way, but something in his posture relaxed slightly, the tension in his shoulders easing as he realized that whatever happened next, he wouldn't face it alone. The security guards, Morrison and Walsh, were beginning to sense the change as well, though they lacked the experience to understand what it meant. Morrison's hand moved instinctively toward his radio, his fingers drumming against the plastic casing as he noticed the way the crowd's attention was shifting away from the stage and toward their confrontation. Walsh's nervous energy increased, his jaw working harder on his gum as he glanced around the gymnasium and began to notice the men who had taken positions throughout the room. Men who carried themselves differently than the other parents. Men whose eyes held a hardness that spoke to experiences far removed from suburban high school graduations. The moment of truth was approaching, the point where words would either de-escalate into embarrassed retreat or explode into something much more serious. Morrison's wounded ego was pushing him toward escalation, his authority challenged in front of an audience that was growing larger and more attentive by the minute. Walsh was beginning to have second thoughts, his survival instincts finally overriding his partner's bravado as he started to understand that they were no longer dealing with an isolated incident, but with something much more complex and potentially dangerous. The 6 SEALs waited with the patience of men who had spent their careers in situations where timing meant the difference between life and death. They had learned long ago that the most effective action was often no action at all, that sometimes the mere presence of strength was enough to deter aggression without the need for violence. They were prepared to move if necessary, their positioning and readiness making it clear that any attempt to physically remove Bobby would be met with immediate and overwhelming response, but they preferred to let the weight of their presence speak for itself. The gymnasium had become a pressure cooker, the tension building toward an inevitable release that would define not just this moment, but the memory of this graduation for everyone present. The security guards stood at a crossroads, their next decision determining whether they would retreat with their dignity intact or push forward into a confrontation they were neither trained nor equipped to handle. Behind them, 6 of America's most elite warriors waited with the calm patience of men who had faced down much worse enemies in much more dangerous places, their silent presence a reminder that some bonds cannot be broken by time or distance, and that true brotherhood means never leaving a man behind, even in a high school gymnasium in small-town Georgia. The air itself seemed to vibrate with potential energy, every person in that room sensing that they were witnessing something significant, something that would be remembered and talked about long after the last diploma had been handed out and the last photograph had been taken. The moment hung suspended like a held breath, pregnant with possibility and consequence, while Bobby sat like a statue in his plastic chair, unmovable and unshakable, surrounded by brothers who had proven their loyalty in the crucible of combat and were prepared to prove it again in the fluorescent-lit arena of civilian confrontation. The moment hung suspended in the gymnasium air like the last note of a hymn, reverberating through every corner of the building with an intensity that made even the fluorescent lights seem to dim in reverence. Commander James Patterson stood in the center aisle, his salt-and-pepper beard catching the overhead lighting as his words settled into the consciousness of every person present. The 6 Navy SEALs remained standing throughout the gymnasium, their positioning creating an invisible perimeter of protection around Bobby Mitchell that spoke louder than any shouted command or dramatic gesture ever could. Morrison and Walsh found themselves caught in a web of their own making, their authority evaporating like morning mist under the Georgia sun. The shorter guard's hand, which had been hovering near his radio with the confidence of a man accustomed to having his orders followed without question, now trembled slightly as he processed the reality of his situation. These weren't just angry parents or concerned relatives. These were men who had faced down Taliban fighters in the mountains of Afghanistan, who had carried wounded comrades through gunfire and mortar attacks, who understood the difference between real authority and the kind that came with a plastic badge and a clipboard. Walsh was the first to crack, his nervous energy finally overwhelming his partner's stubborn pride. "Look, man," he said, his voice carrying a tremor that hadn't been there before. "Maybe we should just—" But Morrison cut him off with a sharp gesture, his face flushed with the kind of embarrassment that comes from being challenged in front of an audience and realizing that retreat is the only option that doesn't end in complete humiliation. The gymnasium had become a living theater, with every parent, grandparent, and sibling serving as witness to a moment that would be remembered long after the last diploma had been handed out and the last photograph had been taken. The ceremony on stage continued with mechanical precision. Names were called, hands were shaken, diplomas were distributed, but the real drama was unfolding in the third row, where a decorated Marine veteran sat with the quiet dignity of a man who had never learned to back down from what was right. Principal Margaret Hendricks appeared at the edge of the confrontation like a guardian angel in a navy blue pantsuit, her 27 years of educational experience having taught her to recognize when a situation was spiraling beyond the control of her security staff. She was a woman in her early 60s who had navigated the integration of Southern schools, had dealt with everything from bomb threats to budget cuts, and who understood that sometimes the best leadership meant knowing when to step in and when to step back. Her approach was measured, deliberate, the walk of someone who had spent decades diffusing volatile situations with teenagers, angry parents, and overzealous school board members. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from years of commanding respect in classrooms and boardrooms, "I think there's been a misunderstanding here." Her eyes moved from Morrison to Walsh, then settled on Bobby with the kind of recognition that suggested she understood exactly who he was and what he represented. "Mr. Mitchell, I believe, I want to personally apologize for any inconvenience. Your seat is exactly where it should be, and I hope you'll accept our gratitude for your service to our country." The words landed like a benediction, transforming the atmosphere from confrontation to reconciliation in the space of a heartbeat. Morrison's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, embarrassment, and finally resignation, as he realized that his authority had not only been challenged, but completely undermined by his own employer. Walsh took a half-step backward, his relief palpable as he recognized that the situation was being diffused by someone with actual authority, rather than escalated by his partner's wounded pride. Bobby looked up at Principal Hendricks with the same steady gaze he had maintained throughout the confrontation. His expression unchanged, but his eyes carrying a flicker of appreciation for her intervention. "No apology necessary, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the quiet courtesy of a man raised to respect educators and authority figures who earned their positions through service rather than intimidation. "I'm just here to watch my daughter graduate." The principal's smile was genuine, warm, the expression of someone who had spent her career celebrating the achievements of young people and understanding the sacrifices their families had made to reach this moment. "Sarah Mitchell," she said, consulting the program in her hand. "Valedictorian, National Honor Society, full scholarship to Emory University. You have every reason to be proud." Commander Patterson remained standing, his eyes locked on the two security guards who were now shifting uncomfortably under the weight of their own poor judgment. His voice, when he spoke, carried the measured tone of a man accustomed to giving orders that were followed without question. "I think these gentlemen understand that their services are no longer needed here," he said, the words carrying an edge that suggested this was not a suggestion but a statement of fact. Morrison opened his mouth as if to protest, but Walsh grabbed his partner's arm with the desperation of a man who recognized that they had already lost this battle, and that continuing to fight would only make their defeat more complete and more public. "Come on," Walsh muttered, his voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the ceremony. "Let's just go." The two guards began their retreat toward the back of the gymnasium, their walk carrying the defeated posture of men who had overplayed their hand and lost everything. Parents and relatives who had been watching the confrontation with growing attention now turned their eyes away, some out of embarrassment for the guards, others out of respect for Bobby's dignity. A few nodded in his direction, silent acknowledgments of what they had witnessed and what it meant. As Morrison and Walsh disappeared through the gymnasium doors, the 6 SEALs began to settle back into their seats with the same coordinated precision they had shown in rising. But their presence remained palpable, a reminder that some bonds transcend time and distance, that loyalty forged in the crucible of combat creates connections that civilian society often fails to understand or appreciate. The ceremony continued with renewed energy, as if the resolution of the confrontation had freed everyone present to fully embrace the celebration taking place on stage. Names were called with greater enthusiasm, applause rang out with more genuine warmth, and the atmosphere shifted from tension to joy as the community came together around the shared experience of honoring their graduating seniors. Bobby settled back into his plastic chair, his posture relaxing slightly for the first time since the guards had approached him. The photograph of his late wife and baby, Sarah, remained tucked inside his jacket pocket, a tangible reminder of the promises he had made and kept through deployments, heartbreak, and the long road of single parenthood. His eyes returned to the stage, where the ceremony was building toward the moment he had driven 8 hours to witness. Principal Hendricks paused at his row before returning to her duties, her hand resting briefly on the back of his chair. "Thank you," she said quietly, her words meant for his ears alone. "For your service, for your dignity, and for showing these young people what real strength looks like." Bobby nodded once, a gesture that carried more weight than 1,000 words. Around him, the gymnasium buzzed with the renewed energy of a community that had witnessed something significant, something that reminded them of the values they claimed to hold dear. Parents, who had been focused on their phones now, watched the stage with greater attention, their children's achievements taking on deeper meaning in the context of what they had just observed. The 6 SEALs remained in their positions throughout the gymnasium, their presence serving as a silent testament to the bonds that military service creates and the loyalty that extends far beyond the battlefield. Commander Patterson caught Bobby's eye from across the room and offered the slightest nod. Not a salute, but an acknowledgment between warriors who understood the weight of the moment and what it represented. Master Chief Mendoza, positioned along the right wall, felt his mind drift back to that day in Kandahar when Bobby had risked everything to save his teammates. The courage he had shown then, the willingness to run through open ground while bullets whistled overhead, was the same courage he had displayed today, sitting calmly in his chair while two men tried to intimidate him into abandoning his rightful place. The connection between those moments, separated by 15 years and thousands of miles, was unbreakable. Senior Chief Thompson, his massive frame still commanding attention even while seated, remembered the covering fire he had provided during Bobby's rescue of Commander Patterson. He had watched through his scope as Bobby dragged his wounded teammate to safety, never hesitating, never looking back, focused only on the mission and the lives that depended on his success. Today's confrontation had required a different kind of courage, the strength to remain still rather than strike back, to maintain dignity in the face of disrespect, but it was courage nonetheless. The other SEALs, Rodriguez, Williams, and Johnson, each carried their own memories of that day in Afghanistan, their own understanding of what Bobby's leadership had meant to their survival and their brotherhood. They had come to this graduation not because they had been asked, but because they understood that some debts can never be fully repaid, only honored through continued loyalty and support. As the ceremony progressed toward its climax, the tension that had gripped the gymnasium began to transform into something else, a sense of shared purpose, of community values affirmed rather than challenged. The confrontation had served as a reminder of what they stood for as Americans, as Georgians, as human beings committed to treating each other with dignity and respect regardless of race, background, or circumstance. The resolution of the conflict had come not through violence or dramatic confrontation, but through the quiet application of moral authority and the power of collective conscience. Principal Hendricks had provided the official intervention, but it was the presence of the 6 SEALs and the dignity of Bobby's response that had truly resolved the situation. The guards had retreated not because they were physically overpowered, but because they were morally outmatched by men who understood the difference between authority and respect, between power and strength. The gymnasium had become a classroom in the truest sense, a place where lessons were learned not from textbooks but from lived experience, where the graduating seniors and their families had witnessed firsthand what it meant to stand up for what was right without compromising one's own integrity. The moment would be remembered and retold, becoming part of the school's history and the community's collective memory. Bobby's eyes remained fixed on the stage, where the ceremony was building toward the moment when Sarah's name would be called. The confrontation was behind him now, resolved through the application of dignity rather than force, through the power of moral authority rather than physical intimidation. He had not moved from his seat, had not raised his voice, had not compromised his principles or his position. He had simply been who he was, a decorated Marine veteran, a devoted father, a man who understood that true strength comes from within and that dignity, once claimed, can never be taken away by others. The 6 SEALs settled into their seats with the satisfaction of men who had fulfilled their duty without compromising their honor. They had stood when standing was required, had remained silent when silence was more powerful than words, and had demonstrated once again that the bonds forged in combat extend far beyond the battlefield into every aspect of civilian life where courage and loyalty are tested. The resolution was complete, but its impact would continue to reverberate through the lives of everyone present. The graduating seniors had learned something about courage and dignity that no textbook could teach. The parents had been reminded of the values they hoped to instill in their children. The community had been shown what it meant to stand together in support of what was right and just, And Bobby Mitchell sat in his plastic chair in the third row, left side, exactly where he belonged, waiting to watch his daughter walk across the stage and claim her diploma. A moment made all the more meaningful by the dignity with which it had been preserved and protected. The parking lot at Riverside High School was nearly empty by the time Bobby and Sarah walked to the burgundy Ford F-150, their footsteps echoing against the asphalt in the fading Georgia twilight. The ceremony had ended 2 hours ago, but the weight of what had transpired inside that gymnasium continued to settle over them like dust after a storm. Sarah clutched her diploma folder in one hand, her honor cords draped over her arm, but her eyes kept drifting to her father's face, searching for something she couldn't quite name. "Dad," she said as they reached the truck, her voice carrying the kind of careful curiosity that comes from witnessing something profound, but not fully understanding its implications. "Why didn't you fight back? Why didn't you raise your voice when those men tried to humiliate you in front of everyone?" Bobby paused with his hand on the door handle, his weathered fingers tracing the chrome as he considered his response. At 58, he had learned that the most important lessons often came not from textbooks or lectures, but from moments like these, when life stripped away pretense and revealed the fundamental choices that define a person's character. He turned to face his daughter, his dark eyes reflecting the wisdom that comes from 3 decades of military service and the hard-earned understanding of what true strength really means. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded respect in places where respect was earned through blood and sacrifice, "I want you to understand something that took me years to learn. Real power isn't about making noise or throwing your weight around. It's about knowing who you are and never letting anyone make you forget it, no matter what they say or do." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew the worn photograph of Margaret holding baby Sarah, the same image that had sustained him through deployments, heartbreak, and the long journey of single parenthood. "Your mother taught me that dignity isn't something you have to defend. It's something you carry inside you that no one can touch unless you let them. Those guards today, they were trying to make me feel small, trying to put me in my place, because they thought my place was somewhere other than the front row, watching my daughter graduate." Sarah's eyes filled with understanding as she processed her father's words. Around them, the parking lot held the lingering echoes of celebration. Scattered confetti, the distant sound of car doors closing, the faint aroma of concession stand popcorn carried on the evening breeze. But their conversation existed in a bubble of intimacy, a father passing down hard-won wisdom to his daughter at one of life's pivotal moments. "But what about those men who stood up for you?" Sarah asked. "Commander Patterson and the others, they were ready to fight." Bobby's expression softened with something that might have been pride mixed with gratitude. "Those men understand something that civilian society often forgets, that loyalty forged in combat creates bonds that time and distance can't break. They stood up, not because I asked them to, but because they recognized that what was happening to me was wrong, and they couldn't stand by and watch injustice unfold without taking a stand." He opened the truck door and helped Sarah climb into the passenger seat, the same seat where Margaret had sat during countless drives to school events, doctor's appointments, and family vacations. The continuity of that simple gesture, father helping daughter, protector caring for the protected, carried its own profound meaning. "The lesson here, sweetheart," Bobby continued as he settled behind the steering wheel, "is that true strength comes from within. It's about maintaining your composure when others lose theirs, about responding to hatred with dignity, about understanding that the people who try to diminish you are usually fighting battles within themselves that have nothing to do with you." As they drove away from Riverside High School, the building fading in the rearview mirror, Sarah understood that she had received more than a diploma that day. She had witnessed a master class in character, a demonstration of how to face adversity with grace, and a reminder that the most powerful responses to injustice often come not from raised voices or clenched fists, but from the quiet strength of people who refuse to be moved from their rightful place in the world. The lesson would stay with her long after the graduation photos had faded and the celebration memories had dimmed. A reminder that dignity once claimed becomes an unshakable foundation upon which to build a life of purpose and meaning. Have you ever witnessed a moment that reminded you what true strength really looks like? Bobby Mitchell's quiet dignity in the face of injustice shows us that real power comes not from making noise, but from knowing who you are and never letting anyone make you forget it. If this story moved you and reminded you of the values that built the greatest generation, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Share your own experiences of quiet courage. Hit that like button if this message resonated with you. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that celebrate the dignity, honor, and unbreakable bonds that define the American spirit. Together, we can keep these timeless lessons alive for future generations.